How's it going, everyone? It's NerdGasm. Last week, I took a look at the video game adaptation of the 1989 Batman film on the NES, one of my favorite titles for that console, and what I consider to be the very best superhero game of that generation. This time, I wanted to review its updated counterpart, released for the Sega Genesis in July of 1991, a year after the NES game came out, and 2 years after the release of the film. While it may be an enhanced version of the NES game, with better graphics on stronger hardware, I don't know if it's necessarily superior, for reasons I will get into. Just like the NES version of the game, Batman on Sega Genesis loosely follows the events of the movie. Gotham is celebrating its 200th anniversary, and a new villain, known as the Joker, begins terrorizing the city, with Batman being the only one capable of stopping him. The Sega Genesis version of Batman the video game is far more accurate to its source material than the NES game was. For starters, the levels feature a lot more environments found within the film. Not only does it have the Gotham streets, Axis chemicals, and the cathedral at the end, but it also has the Flugelheim Museum, which was not in the NES game. In the Axis chemicals level, you also end up knocking Jack Napier into the vat of chemicals that transform him into the Joker, so the villain actually gets an origin this time around. Vicky Vale is also present in the Sega Genesis version of the game. The Joker kidnaps her in order to set a trap for Batman. Apart from a brief description of her in the opening cutscene on the NES, that's all we saw of her. She wasn't mentioned anymore for the remainder of the game. And finally, there are two vehicle stages in Batman on Sega Genesis, one having you drive the Batmobile, based on the scene from the movie when Joker's goons chase Batman following his rescue of Vicky Vale at the museum, and the other where you pilot the Batwing to destroy all of Joker's helicopters and balloons that are dispersing his toxic Smilex gas. The only element from the film I really wish was featured in this game that wasn't even in the NES version is Bob the Goon. I really wish he had a cameo of some kind. Hell, even a boss battle would have been really cool. We get to fight the sword-wielding Joker goon Batman fights in the movie, even the bald guy holding the boombox named Lawrence, twice, once in the Flugelheim Museum and at the end of the game in the boss rush in the cathedral. I get that Bob was dead by the time the cathedral sequence happens in the film, but why not place him in as the first boss or something in the city streets, instead of some random guy in boxing gloves, which, by the way, you also face twice. And that's something I find really disappointing about this game, the boss battles. All of them are just your standard bad guys with specific weapon gimmicks. Swords, boxing gloves, boomboxes, what have you. They should have incorporated Bob the Goon, or even do what the NES game did and have some villains from the comics make an appearance, like Killer Moth or even Firebug. This game essentially followed the movie too accurately, not giving itself any leeway for new ideas. Gameplay-wise, I also think Batman on Sega Genesis suffers in comparison to its NES counterpart. It's not terrible by any means, just not as enjoyable as that game was to play. Batman on Sega Genesis, much like the one on NES, is a side-scrolling platformer. You can take out enemies using fisticuffs, or even batarangs you can throw that do extra damage, but there aren't as many ways to defeat enemies as there were in the NES game, not as much variety. The awesome wall jump, easily the strongest aspect of the NES game in terms of gameplay, has also been removed, and in its place, Batman now has a grappling hook that allows him to climb up to platforms that are above him. You will be using this gadget a lot throughout the game, as it's needed to progress further in many of the levels, especially the cathedral that has you climbing higher and higher to reach the top. While the combat can be fun in areas and the addition of the grappling hook is pretty cool in a few of the levels when it's used, this game just doesn't have as much variety as the NES game does in terms of gameplay, and I feel it gets far more repetitive by the end. It's not terrible, I can't stress that enough, but it's also far from amazing. It's not as fun to play as the NES game is, at least in my opinion. Batman on Sega Genesis is also really easy, like super easy. You don't need any cheats to beat it because it doesn't offer much of a challenge. You'll die a few times here and there, maybe even have to use a continue once or twice, but compared to the first game, this one is a walk in the park. The only real areas of frustration would be those driving stages, because the other vehicles do so much damage to you, and you can lose several lives within a matter of seconds if you're not careful. As long as you try to stay in the top left of the screen though, dodging only when you have to, then you should be fine. The jumping can also be a bit finicky in areas, because Batman does have a double jump in this game. Unlike many platformers though, where you press the jump button again at the height of your jump to jump mid-air a second time, here you have to double tap the button immediately and just aim where you land, which can be kind of awkward. The final boss battle against the Joker can be tough, but nowhere near as difficult as he was in the NES version. His attacks are a lot slower, much easier to dodge and anticipate, and he doesn't have as many hit points either. You can even spam your batarangs at him if you want to. They do massive amounts of damage, so you never even have to get in close with him. So yeah, this game is much easier than the NES version of it is. All in all, I still enjoy Batman the video game on Sega Genesis. It's based off one of my favorite Batman films, and is pretty accurate to its source material, more so than the NES game was. Visually, it's a lot better than the NES version as well, but sometimes graphics don't always make a game, because when it comes to the gameplay, I don't find this version of Batman to be better. I think it gets more repetitive, a bit more stale by the end, and it's far too easy. They should have balanced it a lot more in terms of difficulty. I also would have loved to see a greater variety with its boss battles, because so many of them feel very stock. I would have loved to see Bob the Goon, or any classic villains from the comics that weren't featured in the movie. That would have been really cool and would help break up some of the monotony with everything. I still enjoy Batman on Sega Genesis. It's not a bad superhero game by any means. It's still a lot of fun to play, even to this day. Its graphics have a certain charm to them, its soundtrack is pretty kick-ass, and even though it is really easy, that makes it far more accessible for gamers of all ages, more so than the NES game was in my opinion. I would still recommend you play this game if you haven't already, because it does offer some enjoyment. It's a decent Batman experience, even though I do prefer the NES version over it. And that concludes my review of Batman on Sega Genesis. Let me know what you think of the game in the comment section down below, and if you have played it before. I want to thank everyone for watching this video. Hopefully you were entertained and got something out of it. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to my channel to help support my content, and I will see you all in the next one. Take care.